Welcome to part two of the my invention of race lectures. Two of them. The first one being on the Spanish and Portuguese colonies specifically, and this one being on the French and English. To give us a bit of, well, in the background here, you see obviously a map, 1645 and 1745, how New France grows significantly, and the English colonies don't grow that much. The form of French empire making is very different from the form of English empire making, and both of them are very different from the Spanish and Portuguese, as we'll see. So to review here, right, 15th to 18th centuries, we get the emergence of our modern understanding of race, and there's various factors, right? Imperialism, imperial contact, Europeans coming into contact with people very different from them for the first time, the Reconquest, attitudes and anxieties over religious, quote unquote, purity, specifically around Jews and Muslims, are then translated to the New World. And then the Enlightenment, this idea, main Enlightenment idea about categorization and the quote unquote logical study of things. So all those factors play a role here. So Spain's casta system create racial categories. As we saw with those casta paintings, dozens of them. And it's important to note here, right, what's happening is that it's not documenting something that already exists. It's creating something. As we'll see in the last slide of this presentation, which has an overview of racial categories in the census, U.S. Census from the 19-teens to the 1940s. There's racial categories that appear and disappear. It doesn't mean those races disappear or appear. It means the categories into which people are put change, right? So that's what we're talking about here. Why does all this happen for the Spanish? To protect pure Spaniards, as I said, primarily from Jews and Muslim converts. And then that religious anxiety is translated to a racial anxiety in the New World. And for the Spanish, of course, in the top of the top is the Peninsulares, who are not only white, but born in Spain, right? So as I mentioned, if I have a younger brother that is born in Bogota, Colombia, and I'm born in Sevilla, I'm Peninsulare. The younger brother is not. The younger brother is Criollo. So even, it's not just the whiteness, but the geography of your birth has a role to do with this. And this is a form of white supremacy. It's not the only one. As we'll see, France and England develop very different forms. Okay, so France. France, their settlement, they settle for less, as it were, while Spain is kind of doing a smash and grab of all of the gold and silver in Central and South America. France is not doing much. There's no gold where they settle. They're looking for a northwest passage to Cathay or to China. They don't find it. They're cold and not well suited for agricultural production. People don't want to go. You have to go for 3 years on a contract of indenture. Soldiers that go there have to stay there. They send orphaned girls. I mean, this is awful, right? They send orphaned girls to for wives for some of these French men. And as you saw in our reading, right, the New England colonies, they get, I mean, tens of thousands within a decade. There's tens of thousands of settlers in New England. After about 100 years from the initial voyages of Cartier, there's still only about 25,000 people in New France. People just don't want to go. Mostly it is single men. So, of course, what happens in that scenario? The French single men, the trappers, intermarry with native women, and thus creating a kind of new race. And again, this is the French perspective. This is not a statement of fact. This is a statement of French perspective. Although it's interesting to note that in Canada, their First Nations, their indigenous communities in Canada are referred to as First Nations peoples. There is a recognized First Nation called the Métis, M-E, with an accent over the E, T-I-S, Métis, who are the descendants of these unions between French men and Native women, and they're actually recognized as a First Nations people. Because they go back so long, and that they eventually do experience the same kind of harassment and discrimination as other First Nations. So they actually are considered a First Nation people. Anyway, the French in the 17th century see themselves as creating a kind of new race. I'll have more on that in 1 second. They're not rich, so the Peninsulares who go to New Spain, they just want to get back. They want to make some money and get back to Spain. This is not the case in New France. People are not rich. They stay there for a long time. As I said, they intermarry. And this is where the kind of uniquely French kind of cultural superiority translates into a kind of racial attitude, where the Spanish just think they're better than everyone. And they don't care if there's 1 or 100,000 categories of different races below them. The French perspective is that they're actually improving the race. They're creating a race that is actually doing a favor to native culture by intermarrying with them. So again, a very unique perspective here. We can say more in class. This would be an interesting conversation to have about choice here. This narrative, especially when compared to the English narrative, the narrative of French colonization seems as though it's nicer, right? It's not about subjugating people. It's not about slavery, at least in New France. It very much is in the Caribbean. So we might be tempted to see this as a more humane form of empire making. But it raises a very important question about choice. These women are, quote unquote, choosing, right, to intermarry, to have children with these French trappers and traders. But we have to ask, what does choice mean under conditions in which your entire world has been turned upside down? These French traders potentially offer your best chance at survival. Your culture, your language, everything that you know is changing dramatically. The quote-unquote choice to have children with a French trapper really does beg the question of what does that choice really mean under the circumstances, right? What does free will mean for an indigenous woman in these under these circumstances? Anyway, that was a very interesting conversation that we could have in class. Okay, so that is the French. They are, in a very kind of arrogant kind of way, thinking that they are improving this race. That is their form of white supremacy, right? Saying we're so good that we're actually going to improve your race by intermarrying with you. So Spanish have one way, French have another way. English have yet another way. And this map of Jamestown illustrates it very, very well. The English colonies are settler colonies. They are not like the French, single, right? Wood runners, coureurs du bois, or whatever they are called, intermarrying with native women. They're not the Spanish resource extraction kind of ventures in New Spain. They are settler colonies. That means whole families come over, they expropriate or take native land, and they build walls around their communities, and they are there to stay. Whole families, right? They're going to have kids, and they're there to stay. That's called a settler colony. New France and all of the colonies in the New World eventually become settler colonies, obviously. The thing with settler colonialism is you have to be very careful about one thing cannot happen, and that is precisely what's happening in New France. That is the intermarriage with English and native people, native women primarily. And this is a question from English common law about inheritance. If an English man with, say, a lot of property and one daughter from an English woman has a child with a Native American woman, and that child is also a son, what happens to the property? right? That's the firstborn son. Does that person inherit the property? So in settler colonialism, this is really important. You cannot do this, right? No intermarriage allowed. And I have here this little graphic, 1614. This is the kind of narrative of John Rolfe and Pocahontas. That is a marriage. 1614 is not 1700, right? 1614 is 7 years after Jamestown is even founded. It is very, very early days. By 1700, a attitude of separation is very much the kind of par for the course for English settler colonies. So what the English eventually end up doing, they build walls, they conquer, they kill. They do not mix races. So this is also a form, right, of white supremacy. Very different from the Spanish, very different from the French, but it is white supremacy nonetheless, right? The attitude towards natives, the anti-native racism that the settler colonies in North America experience is different from the kind of anti-black racism that develops first in the Caribbean and then in through the mainland colonies. And we'll go over that briefly here, how that works. The Caribbean is different from the mainland. It is the tropics. And in the tropics, you can grow things like indigo, rice, tea, sugar, and then coffee, which you see here, 3 illustrations from Antigua, which is a British colony. The illustrations are from the 1830s. And there's 10 in total that depict the kind of seasons or styles of work around sugarcane production. As you see here in the bottom image, it is almost industrial, right? That sugarcane needs to be picked very quickly. It needs to be processed very quickly. It is highly labor-intensive work, whether it's sugar, indigo, rice, tea, coffee. The tropics have a very short fallow season, or kind of a season where you're not planting. It's really like 10 months of the year people can be working, and a lot of people, right? You need a lot of people to pick the entire crop of sugarcane within a matter of days. You need a lot of people to process it very, very quickly. You need a lot of people to plant it all at the same time. So this tropical environment lends itself to the development of enslaved labor, right? Of bringing over enslaved laborers to work in these tropical conditions. And so much so that you get in the Caribbean colonies with overwhelming black majorities. I mean, Barbados is 90% black. Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, when it's French, is 90% black. So you have enormous black majorities, very, very small white minorities. And what this leads to is very, very, very strict and very violent laws to control, to subjugate, to subdue the enslaved laborers. So let's look at one form here in Barbados. And this is where we see the beginning of a labor form. That is to say, slavery is a labor form. It's a form of labor, right? As opposed to wage labor or indentured servitude or what have you, right? Feudal systems of labor. Slavery is a labor form. But through the proliferation of that labor form, we see what is generated is a racial form, this idea of the people that do this are inferior, right? And let's see why here. Barbados Slave Code, 1661. These are the first specifically anti-black, very strict, very violent anti-black laws that provide the framework for similar laws in Jamaica and South Carolina. I mean, we won't go over the details here, but very punitive, very, very medieval, right, in their ways that they would punish an enslaved laborer for even the slightest of offenses, right? That happens in Barbados, and that is exported to other colonies, including South Carolina. South Carolina also has very big enslaved laboring populations. South Carolina's main commodity crop is rice. So South Carolina is close enough to the tropics where they kind of get away with this form of gang labor, enslaved labor, etc. In Virginia is a little different. Virginia is a little cooler. They don't rely as much on massive groups of enslaved laborers to perform agricultural functions. Remember, Virginia primary commodity crop is tobacco. In Virginia, the first labor form that they have is indentured English servants. They bring over indentured servants, and they mess with wealthy Virginians mess with the contracts. It's very actually hard to get out of your contract, right? Your contract is extended by several months if you miss a day's work. All of these kind of shenanigans to keep English people in indenture, but many of them eventually do get out, and because they're English, they have a tradition going back to, someone can check me here if I'm wrong, Magna Carta is 1015 or something like that. Very, very old sense of certain rights, that if you were an English man, you have certain rights. So even these poor indentured servants feel entitled to accessing English common law, going to the courts, suing, all of this stuff. That's a problem for elite, wealthy Virginians. They don't want these rabble-rousers in their midst. So what do? They look for a substitute, and the substitute is seen as enslaving African laborers. Because, again, it hasn't fully developed into like anti-black racism yet. The sense is like, we're English, we have English common law, we have a long history of rights. We're better than the French too. We're better than the Spanish as well. That we are just better because we have a parliament, we're a parliamentary monarchy, we're far more advanced and civilized. So the thinking is, right, people in the shores of Africa have no sense of this, right? They can't access the kind of sense of English entitlement that these indentured servants have, so let's enslave them. That does evolve into, right, fusing that cultural superiority with a sense of racial superiority. 1662, Partus Sequitur Ventrum is a law that goes against the tradition of English common law. English common law generally, your status is determined by the status of your father, right? Issue being, right, back to thinking about here, the most important element of settler colonialism is you cannot intermarry for fear of, right, property inheritance being split up among people that are not English. So Partus Sequitur Ventrum kind of changes how one's status is inherited, and it's no longer the father, it is the mother, right? Of course, this means if a English enslaver rapes a enslaved woman, that the child is a slave, right? Cannot sue in court for rights, right? Because they are born into slavery. This is a very, very important change because it establishes a new form of slavery. People, since the beginning of time, there's been slaves. Yeah, of course, right? But it's different in the sense that ancient slavery was, one, largely domestic. You could manumit or buy your way out of slavery easier. And it wasn't something you were born into, right? So someone could be enslaved and have children that were not enslaved, right? It was kind of just like the worst job possible that you couldn't get out of unless you like paid off your contract. In the New World, this is different. Slavery becomes race-based and heritable. That means you can inherit the status of your parent, your mother primarily. Right? Race-based heritable slavery is a new form of slavery. So in conclusion, to review, all three powers have different kinds of empire, right? The Spanish is about resource extraction. The French is very small footprint. They trade, they trap. And the English are a settler colony. All three empires have different racial taxonomies that develop. The Spanish, whitest on top. They don't care how many categories below. The French intermarry to improve natives. That is also puts white people on top. It's another form of white supremacy. And then the English build walls, exclude, change your laws to exclude any mixed race offspring. That is another form of white supremacy. So even though each has a different attitude between the European and the native or the African, all three demonstrate a form of this group is on top, right? Even though they're all very, very different. So as I said in the last two lectures, race is constructed over a very specific period of time, right? 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century. But it's also constructed very differently in different geographic places, right? Race means something different in New Spain, New France, and New England. And then lastly, the most important thing here is that slavery in the New World is different. It starts in the English colonies and it spreads to the French and Spanish as well. But it's something that has the tightest grip in the English colonies, and that is the sense that slavery is not domestic. It's for industrial, agricultural labor, and it is race-based and heritable. That is something new. So that is the review of racial formation and empire formation in the three primary colonial powers in the New World.